So let me thank you for accepting our presentation for your conference. We're really happy to be here. We have two presentations with my colleague Katarina Bockova. The first one deals with Bosnia and Herzegovina as a specific European country, and then the second one will be presented tomorrow, and it's about opinion of our students of ethnic and religious differences after migration crisis in Europe a few years ago. Let me start with the first one, so with Bosnia and Herzegovina, and to explain why it's a specific and unique European country with frozen conflict. Maybe it's specific and a unique world country. I will explain during my presentation. My distinguished colleagues from Nigeria and Kyrgyzstan were talking about historical memory, and were talking about the necessity of understanding during the conflict resolution. And it seems like in former Yugoslavia, and especially in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it disappeared about 30 years ago. And it was maybe very, very surprised because you know about the historical memory. The European continent was the continent with the very, very visible impact of two world wars, with the visible impact of Cold War. So for the population of Europe, as the industrially very, very development region of the world, it was very, very unimaginable that the conflict of such an extent could appear. But let me start with the history a little bit, because the history is maybe one of the explanation of the conflict of former Yugoslavia. What about Europe? Before the World War I, there were some great or very, very big empires. And the most important, maybe for our presentation, the most important one were Austria-Hungary Empire and Ottoman Empire, or Turkey, before the World War I. After the war, the Europe was very different. So before the year 1940 and 1918, the Europe really changed. The new national countries or the new national states were created. For example, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary. All these countries were part of big empires in the past. But the case of Yugoslavia was very different. Why? The countries or the people from Yugoslavia, because you know, the Yugoslavia was also the new state after the World War I. But for example, comparing to Czechoslovakia or Poland, it was not national country. It was the country where different nations and different religions were put in. For example, Croatia and Slovenian part were part from Austria-Hungary in the past, and these countries were Catholic. Serbia was even independent in the 19th century, and it was Christian country but Orthodox. For example, Macedonia as the country was influenced in the past by the Ottoman Empire. Montenegro was formally but not really independent, and all these different parts were trying to live together in one country, and it seemed impossible. You know, here is the how the former Yugoslavia looked between two world wars. And this is the former Yugoslavia, or part of the former Yugoslavia during the Second World War. I would like to stay in the period of Second World War for a few minutes. Why? Because the first very big differences appeared during that part. Probably you know that Croatia as the state was satellite state of the Nazi Germany during the World War II. And of course, Croatians, they were famous for resistant movements against Hitler. One of the most important person who led the resistant movement was former President Tito. But officially, Croatians were ally of Nazi Germany. And as an official ally, they were very cruel, especially towards Serbs living there. So after the World War II, new country was created, federation of 6 parts: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia Herzegovina, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Serbia. It seemed that it could be stable, but it was stable only only to the end of the Cold War. I mean, to the 1989. And now we can start with Bosnia Herzegovina, because Bosnia Herzegovina is a very specific state of the former Yugoslavia. If you remember, at the beginning I said that in former Yugoslavia they live Serbs, they live Croatians, they live Muslims, so there are Catholics and Orthodox, etc., etc. But all these people lived in one of the part of the former Yugoslavia in Bosnia Herzegovina. In Bosnia Herzegovina they live Serbs with their interest. There is Muslims with their interests and Croatians with their interests. So during the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia, it became very, or it seems to be very, it was impossible to live together. Former Yugoslavia, or the conflicts in former Yugoslavia, they outbroke in 1991. The most important wars on this territory, they were led in 2 parts, in Croatia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Why? Because in Croatia there was a very huge Serbian minority, and as I said, in Bosnia and Herzegovina all these people lived together. This is Bosnia and Herzegovina, this is Serbian part, and this darker part is the part of Croats and Muslims, the so-called Bosniaks. Or this red part, this part, is Serbian part, is this blue part, is the part of Bosniak and Croats. What about the political situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina? In Bosnia and Herzegovina, in 1991, they lived about 40% of Muslims, so-called Bosniaks, about 30% of Serbs, and 70% of Croats. Together, it was about 4.5 million citizens in 1991. What about the situation now? In 2018, they live only 3.5 million of people. This declining on the people is the result of the situation in the country. It means that the people of this country, they see no future in this country, so they are leaving Bosnia and Herzegovina. The war in the Bosnia and Herzegovina was war with about 130 dead people and about 2.2 million of refugees. This war was ended by Dayton Peace Agreement, and of course, this Dayton Peace Agreement, it really ended the war. But what was not ended, it was the conflict in the country. So the conflict in the country is a really frozen conflict with all the consequences for the future. Two different entities were created. The first entity was Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the second entity is so-called Republika Srpska. In Bosnia and Herzegovina entity, it's this green or blue part. In this Bosnia Herzegovina entity, there lives Croats. In Serbian part, in the Republika Srpska part, it's the red part. They live Serbs. So the country is the country with the different people and with different, for example, languages and cultures. For example, Bosnian, Croatian, Serbians, and of course with different view on the political future, because people from these Muslims or Croat part, they would like to join, for example, European Union and NATO. For Serbian living there, the joining of the NATO is impossible as the consequence of the war in 1999, as NATO army was bombing Serbia and the capital of Serbia, Belgrade. So the views on the political future of this part of this country are very, very different. And what's dangerous, that people in Bosnia and Herzegovina, they vote only ethnically and religiously. So people from Serbian part, they vote only for Serbian political parties. From Croatian parts, only for Croatian political parties. As these Bosniaks, they are usually Muslims, they vote only for their political parties. So there is no whole country party. There is no party of the reconciliation of the people. So the nationalism in the country is really growing. Dayton treat agreements, or peace agreements, created very, very interesting political situation. And that's why the Bosnia and Herzegovina is unique. Probably we do not find nowhere in the world the situation when there is not one president, but there is a presidency that is consisted of three people. One is Serb, one is Croat, and one is Bosniak. They are rotating as a president of presidencies, but it will not solve the situation for the future. So the situation is really conserved, it's frozen. Also, the nationalism in Bosnia and Herzegovina is still growing. As an example, I would like to show you this map. As the consequence of Dayton treaties, I said that there are two entities. One entity is Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the second one is Republika Srpska. But as the result of growing nationalism, for example, Croats, and those are the blue ones, they would like to have their own entity in this country. So the country will be divided more if this proposal is accepted. Probably not. What's also problem in Bosnia and Herzegovina? The problems is growing by the interest of international players, especially Russia and Turkey has very different interests in the Bosnia and Herzegovina. Russia is supporting Serbs, and Turkey is supporting Bosniaks. It means Muslims. So if there are some foreign investments, like for example Russian investments we can find only in Serbian part. Turkey's investments we can find only all Gulf states investments only Muslim parts of the country. So again, the country is developing very, very differently. What about the economy of the country? As you see, the unemployment as the consequence of this crisis and different interest of different players is still very high. In 1997, it was about 45%, but today, in 2018, or today, so 1 year ago, it was about 27%. So it's really, really high. And what about the unemployment of the youth? About 2/3 of the youth, it means the people between 18 to 24 are without employment, and they are not attending universities. They are really at home. So this also the problem. What about the immigration from the country? You can see that between the years 2013 and 2017, about 150,000 people left the country. For example, only on 2016, European Union gave 80,000 work permits for people of Bosnia and Herzegovina to the EU. This has very, very grave consequence for the future, because, for example, you can see the ratio between employed people and potential employment pensioners in 2017. For example, 1.12 of employed people was working for one pensioner in the country. So it's again the evidence that the conflict of the country is dangerous for the development of the country in the future. Of course, the country is looking for investors and investments. As I said before, the most important investors are Russia, Turkey, Croatia, and EU countries. But there are some very, very high risks for investors, and those are political instability, lack of efficient administration, high taxes, corruption, or bad infrastructure. I would like to conclude maybe with the hope that the politicians in Bosnia and Herzegovina will maybe find this historical memory, and maybe they will find some willingness for mutual understanding. But for now, we cannot see it, and maybe what's very dangerous in Bosnia and Herzegovina, those are the processes in Europe, that the politics in Europe is more and more radical right now. There is place for extremism and not for reconciliation right now. Thank you.